Give me 5 minutes, I'll prove it, Annie Johnson said, her fingers still cold from the ice scoop in her hand. I mean it. I only need 5 minutes. I can prove he didn't steal your cufflink. 5 minutes? Richard Whitmore snapped. Do you really think 5 minutes is enough time for you to prove anything? I want the police here right now. His voice tore through the Silver Oak Steakhouse so loudly that the jazz coming from the overhead speakers seemed to disappear behind it. Marcus Lee, the server assigned to his table, stood in front of him trembling. Sir, please, Marcus said, his voice thin. I didn't take it. I swear to God, I didn't. I only brought the drinks, cleared the salad plates, and refilled your water. That's all. Richard jabbed a finger toward his chest. You were standing right here. Yes, sir. I was serving tables. And now my cufflink is missing. Marcus shook his head again, struggling to stay calm. I don't know where it went, but I didn't steal anything. Richard's expression darkened instantly. Call the police, right now, he barked, turning sharply toward the manager. Not in 5 minutes, not after you pretend to search the kitchen, right now. Dale Porter, the restaurant manager, hurried across the dining room so fast his tie slipped crookedly from beneath his collar. His face had gone pale. Everyone at the Silver Oak knew exactly how important Richard Whitmore was to the restaurant. Mr. Whitmore, I am truly sorry, Dale said, his voice nearly catching in his throat. We'll handle this immediately. I promise you, you should have handled it before my diamond cufflink disappeared. Dale turned sharply toward Marcus, trying to keep his voice firm. Empty your pockets. Marcus stared at him. Dale, come on. Marcus, just do it. I've worked here for 7 years, and if you didn't take anything, then there shouldn't be a problem. The words hit Marcus hard, but in the end, he obeyed. Slowly, under the watchful eyes of everyone in the room, Marcus pulled out a folded order pad, a pen, a cheap lighter he often used to help customers light birthday candles, and 3 crumpled dollar bills from earlier tips. Nothing else. But Dale still wasn't satisfied. He stepped closer and patted down Marcus's suit pockets, then checked both sides of his apron. Marcus stood frozen in humiliation. His jaw clenched tightly, his eyes fixed on the floor. Dale continued searching the pocket near his chest, then the back pockets of his pants. Nothing. No diamond cufflink. For a moment, Annie thought that might help Richard calm down. Instead, it only made things worse. Richard slammed his palm down on the table. The glass of bourbon in front of him trembled. Of course it wasn't there, he said through clenched teeth. He had plenty of time to get rid of it. He walked past the kitchen twice. He could have thrown it anywhere. Marcus lifted his head, his eyes wounded. I didn't throw anything away. Richard snapped his head to the side and spat on the floor. Not close enough to hit anyone, but close enough for everyone to understand exactly what the gesture meant. Contempt. Disgust. Do you even know how much that cufflink is worth? Richard said. $80,000. Custom-cut diamonds. Not some cheap button sold in a department store. A few staff members had gathered near the kitchen entrance. Becky, a young waitress with tightly tied red hair, whispered to Jamal, the busboy standing beside her. What happened? Why is Mr. Whitmore yelling at Marcus? Jamal lowered his voice. He says Marcus stole his cufflink. Kyle, another waiter, stepped closer with a worried expression. Marcus, if something really happened, just give it back before the police get involved. Marcus stared at him. You think I took it? I didn't say that. But that's what you meant. Kyle looked away. I'm just saying Richard Whitmore isn't the kind of man you want accusing you. Marcus let out a bitter laugh, but there was no humor in it. Then maybe he shouldn't accuse people without proof. Richard heard him. Proof? He snapped. You want proof? That cufflink was on my wrist before you came near this table. Now it's gone. That's more than enough proof for me. Annie felt something tighten in her chest. She stepped forward. Mr. Whitmore, Annie said, trying to keep her voice calm. Please settle down. Let me prove that he didn't steal from you. Richard turned toward her as if he had forgotten she was still standing there. Annie continued before he could interrupt. You have to give him a chance to explain. You have to let someone figure out what actually happened. You don't have any proof, yet you've already decided he's guilty. Dale hissed. Annie, enough. No, she said, never taking her eyes off Richard. Not yet. Richard's jaw tightened. Do you even know who you're talking to? A man who lost something valuable, Annie replied. not a man with the right to destroy someone's life without evidence. Richard leaned slightly toward her. You're just a waitress. Yes, sir. And now you're an investigator too? No, sir. I'm just someone who pays attention. Marcus whispered, Annie, don't do this. You'll lose your job. She glanced at him. His hands were still trembling. I'm not doing this to keep my job, she said quietly. I'm doing it because you didn't take that cufflink. Richard let out a cold laugh. Wonderful. Employee loyalty. This isn't loyalty, Annie said. Richard stared at her for a moment, then spread his hands with a mocking smile. All right, he said. You want 5 minutes. I'll give you 10. Go ahead and run your little investigation. Make it impressive. Annie shook her head. I don't need 10 minutes. Richard narrowed his eyes. You're refusing extra time? Yes, sir. Why? Because if I'm right, 5 minutes is enough. And if I'm wrong, 10 minutes won't save him. That answer made several people near the bar stop whispering. Richard looked irritated, but he finally stepped back from Marcus. Fine, he said. 5 minutes. Start talking. Annie glanced at Richard's loose shirt cuff, then shifted her eyes to the stainless steel bucket beside the table. Under the warm lighting, a thin layer of condensation clung to its surface. 3 imported beer bottles leaned against each other in the melting ice, their green glass slick with water. The bucket sat close to Richard Whitmore's left hand, close enough that someone adjusting a sleeve could have accidentally brushed against it, but Annie still hadn't touched it. Before anyone moves anything, Annie said, I need this table left exactly the way it is. Dale let out a sharp breath. Annie, you're not a police investigator. No. She replied calmly. I'm trying to stop an innocent man from being blamed. Richard's expression immediately hardened. Watch your words. I am being careful, sir. That's why I observe before I accuse. A few people near the bar began whispering. Someone was still holding up a phone, recording everything. Marcus noticed and lowered his head, as if avoiding the camera might somehow lessen the humiliation. Annie noticed too. She turned slightly toward Richard. You said your cufflink was still on your sleeve before Marcus came near the table. That's right. Did you actually check before he served you, or did you simply assume it was there because it was supposed to be? Richard opened his mouth, then closed it again. Dale quickly stepped in. Mr. Whitmore doesn't need to answer questions from, Yes, he does, Annie interrupted, still calm. If he wants the truth. Richard gave her a look that would have made most employees step back immediately. Annie didn't move. I wore a pair of cufflinks, he said. One is still on my sleeve. The other was definitely there when I arrived. After you sat down, did you feel it there? No. Did you touch your sleeve? Richard frowned. People adjust their sleeves all the time. Yes, sir, and you did it several times. Kyle, still standing near the kitchen entrance, whispered. How does she even know that? Becky whispered back, because Annie notices everything. Richard heard enough to turn his head toward them. The staff immediately fell silent. Annie continued. You arrived before your guest. You were irritated that he was late. You checked your watch, then pulled your sleeve down. You did that more than once. Richard glanced at the empty chair across from him. His business guest had stepped away to answer a phone call just minutes before the shouting started. The chair was still slightly pushed back, the napkin still resting on the seat. I checked my watch, Richard said. That doesn't prove anything. It proves your left wrist moved toward this side of the table. Annie pointed lightly, no drama, no exaggeration, just enough to draw everyone's attention toward the bucket. Richard followed her gesture and frowned. The beer bucket? Yes. My cufflink couldn't have fallen into a beer bucket. You don't know that. I would have heard it. Annie carefully scanned everything around her. The ice, the metal, the glass bottles, the table crowded with plates, silverware, and Richard's half-finished bourbon. Not exactly, she said calmly. There's music playing, people are talking, the bucket has melted ice water in it. Something small could fall in without making the kind of noise you'd notice. Richard let out a dry laugh. You seem to have an answer for everything. No, sir, Annie replied. I just pay attention to what I see. For the first time, Marcus lifted his head. His voice nearly broke. Annie. She glanced at him briefly. It was not soft enough to distract him, but enough to let him know she had not forgotten about him. Dale rubbed the back of his neck uneasily. Fine, check the bucket, but make it quick. Richard pointed at Annie. If this turns into some kind of show, I swear. It already became a show. Annie interrupted. The moment he was forced to empty his pockets in front of almost the entire restaurant. Dale's eyes widened. Becky froze. Even Kyle stopped shifting his weight. Richard stared at Annie for a long moment. "You've got a sharp mouth for someone wearing a name tag." The comment stung, but Annie refused to take the bait. "My name tag isn't evidence either, sir." Richard's face turned red. "Check the bucket," he snapped. Annie walked to the nearby station and slipped on a fresh pair of clear gloves. Her fingers stiffened from the cold water and ice. But she kept her movements slow and steady. She brought over an empty silver tray and placed it on the edge of the table. "I'll remove the bottles first." Dale leaned closer. "Do it where everyone can see." "I was planning to." Annie lifted the first bottle. Water ran down its sides and dripped onto the tray. Nothing was attached to it. She removed the second bottle, then the third. Soon, only wet glass and a thin layer of water remained on the tray. Richard crossed his arms. "Finished yet?" Annie picked up the ice tongs and began transferring the cubes one by one onto the tray. The ice clinked sharply against the metal. "Nothing." Marcus closed his eyes. Kyle muttered under his breath. "Oh God." Annie kept going. She could feel Richard's impatience pressing down beside her. 4 minutes, he warned. She said nothing. One cube slipped from the tongs and splashed back into the bucket. Richard's mouth curled into a cruel little smile. "You see," he said, "this is what happens when people confuse confidence with competence." Annie paused for half a second. Then she took a slow breath and tilted the bucket slightly toward the light. Melted water slid along the bottom. Thin shards of ice floated quietly near the edge, and for the first time, she saw it. Annie lowered the tongs. Richard instinctively leaned forward. Carefully, she reached in and lifted the object out. The diamond cufflink emerged from the ice, dripping cold water onto the white tablecloth. Under the amber light, it flashed sharply against Richard's open sleeve. No one spoke. Annie placed it gently onto a folded napkin in front of him, directly between his plate and his bourbon glass. "Here it is," she said. Richard stared at the cufflink, then at the bucket, then at Marcus. Marcus covered his mouth with a trembling hand. His eyes glistened, but he fought to keep his composure. If this story touched your heart, please like the video, leave a comment telling us where you're watching from, and subscribe to the channel for more emotional stories like this. Dale swallowed hard. "Mr. Whitmore." Richard did not answer. Annie slowly removed her gloves and set them beside the tray. "Marcus didn't steal from you. Your cufflink fell off when you adjusted your sleeve. It dropped into the ice bucket." Kyle lowered his eyes to the floor. Becky covered her mouth with her hand. Richard picked up the cufflink, but his hand was no longer as steady as before. Annie's voice remained calm, but every word landed heavily. "You found what you lost, sir. Now he deserves to get back what you took from him." Nobody moved for several seconds after Annie spoke. The dining room that had been buzzing with conversation earlier now felt strangely small, as if everyone inside the Silver Oak had been pulled into the same uncomfortable silence. Ice melted slowly in the metal bucket beside the table. Somewhere near the kitchen, a dishwasher door slammed shut, but even that sound seemed distant. Richard Whitmore still held the diamond cufflink between his fingers. Marcus lowered his trembling hand from his mouth. "Mr. Whitmore, I told you I didn't take it." Richard looked at him, but not directly, more like a man staring at the consequences of his own temper. Dale cleared his throat carefully. "Well, now that we know what happened," Annie interrupted quietly, "is that a man was treated like a criminal without proof." Dale shot her a warning look. "Annie." "No," Marcus said suddenly. His voice was still shaky, but there was anger inside it now. "She's right." The words surprised everyone, including Marcus himself. Richard finally set the cufflink down on the table. "You got your apology." Marcus stared at him. "Did I?" Richard's jaw tightened again. For a second, Annie thought he might explode all over again. But this time the anger didn't have the same force behind it. The room had changed sides on him. He knew it. "You want me to say I was wrong?" Richard asked. Marcus answered before Annie could. "No. I want you to understand what you almost did." That landed harder than shouting would have. Richard looked away first. At the back of the dining room, Becky quietly lowered the phone she had been recording with. Kyle rubbed the back of his neck, embarrassed now that the truth sat in plain sight on the white napkin. "I shouldn't have said what I said." Kyle muttered toward Marcus. Marcus gave a tired laugh. Funny how people become careful after evidence shows up. Kyle didn't answer. Dale stepped closer to Richard with the nervous smile of a man trying to save a business relationship before it cracked completely. Mr. Whitmore, dessert is on the house tonight. Anything you need, we'll take care of it. Richard looked irritated by the offer. I'm not here for free cheesecake. No, sir, of course not. Annie removed the tray of wet bottles from the table and turned to leave, but Richard spoke before she could take 2 steps. You, he said. She stopped. What's your name again? Annie Johnson. You always interfere with situations that don't concern you? She faced him again. It concerned me when someone innocent was being humiliated. Dale nearly closed his eyes in frustration, but Richard surprised everyone by asking something else instead. How old are you? 18. You're in school? Yes, sir. What kind of school? Atlanta Community College. Richard looked at her more carefully now, as if the answer had shifted something in his head. And you work here part-time? I work here because tuition doesn't pay itself. A few guests nearby pretended not to listen while listening to every word. Richard leaned slightly against the edge of the table. You noticed all that because you were watching my hands. I noticed details. That's not normal for an 18-year-old server. Annie shrugged lightly. When people don't believe you automatically, you learn to pay attention to everything. The sentence hung in the air longer than she intended. Richard heard it too. She could tell by the way his expression changed for half a second before he hit it again. Marcus picked up the order pad Dale had made him empty earlier. His dignity came back slowly, piece by piece, but Annie could still see the damage sitting behind his eyes. Some embarrassments didn't disappear just because the truth arrived afterward. You okay? Annie asked quietly. Marcus nodded once. Yeah, but he wasn't. Richard reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and pulled out a thick fold of cash. Hundreds. He placed them on the table beside the cufflink. For him, he said. Marcus stared at the money without touching it. Then Richard looked at Annie. And for you, Annie didn't move either. Dale quickly jumped in. Annie. Take the tip. She kept her eyes on Richard. Why? Richard frowned. Because you helped solve the problem. No. Annie said calmly. I solved your mistake. The words hit harder than she expected. Even Becky looked down after that. Richard gave a short breath through his nose. Not anger this time. Something closer to disbelief. You've got guts, he muttered. My mother calls it rent money courage. That almost pulled a smile from Marcus despite everything. Richard studied Annie another moment. Most people in this room stayed quiet. Most people in this room were afraid. And you weren't? Annie looked around the restaurant. The expensive whiskey behind the bar. The polished wood walls. The customers pretending not to stare. Then she looked back at him. Of course I was. Richard seemed caught off guard by the honesty. Then why step in? Because fear doesn't look as bad later as regret does. Nobody said anything after that. Dale finally broke the silence. All right, everyone. Show's over. Back to work. The room slowly came back to life. Quiet conversations returned table by table. Glasses clinked again. The piano version of Fly Me to the Moon drifted softly through the speakers. But the mood inside the restaurant had shifted. People were still looking at Annie differently. Not like a server anymore. Richard glanced once more at the wet cufflink resting beside his untouched bourbon. You really only needed 5 minutes. Annie picked up the tray. I told you that from the beginning. As she turned toward the kitchen, Richard called after her again. Annie. She stopped but did not turn fully around. What are you studying? Criminal justice. Richard let out a quiet laugh under his breath, almost to himself. Yeah, he said. That makes sense. Annie disappeared through the kitchen doors carrying the tray of melting ice while Richard Whitmore remained standing beside the table, staring at the place where a young black waitress had just forced him to see something money usually protected him from. Not the missing cufflink. Himself. The kitchen doors swung shut behind Annie, cutting off most of the noise from the dining room. The sudden heat from the grills wrapped around her immediately, carrying the smell of butter, steak, garlic, and dish soap. Cooks shouted table numbers over the hiss of the flat top, while servers rushed around balancing trays and drink orders as if nothing important had happened out there. But everyone had heard. That was the problem with restaurants. News traveled faster than food. Annie set the tray beside the dish station and peeled off her gloves. Her fingers were still cold from the ice bucket, though the rest of her felt too warm. "Girl," Becky whispered, hurrying in behind her, "do you realize what you just did?" Annie grabbed a towel and dried her hands. "I solved a problem. You embarrassed Richard Whitmore in front of half the restaurant." "I embarrassed him?" Annie turned toward her. "He accused Marcus of theft before anybody even looked for the thing." Becky lowered her voice. "I know. I'm just saying people like him don't enjoy being corrected." Marcus entered the kitchen slowly a second later. The room quieted a little when he walked in. A dishwasher looked away awkwardly. One of the line cooks muttered, "Damn." Under his breath, Marcus stopped near the prep counter and rubbed both hands over his face. "You okay?" Annie asked again. This time he nodded longer before speaking. "I will be. You shouldn't have had to go through that," she said. Marcus let out a tired laugh. "You think this is the first time somebody looked at me and decided I was guilty before I opened my mouth?" Annie leaned against the counter silently. Marcus reached for a paper cup near the soda station and filled it with water. His hands still shook slightly. "Difference is," he said, "most times nobody steps in." Becky looked guilty hearing that. Kyle walked through the kitchen doors carrying an empty tray. The moment he saw Marcus, he slowed down. "Hey," Kyle said awkwardly. "About earlier." Marcus stared at him without answering. Kyle scratched the back of his neck. "I wasn't saying you stole it. You just thought I probably did," Marcus replied. "No, man. You got nervous because a rich guy started yelling. That's what happened." Kyle opened his mouth, then closed it again because there was nothing useful left to say. Annie picked up another stack of clean glasses from the rack. "People panic around money," she said quietly. Marcus looked at her. "Yeah, especially when the money's white and loud." Nobody laughed at that one. Dale entered the kitchen a moment later, already irritated before he even spoke. "Annie." "Office." "Now." Becky winced softly. Marcus straightened. "Dale, don't start with her." "I said office." Annie set the glasses down and followed him past the walk-in cooler toward the cramped manager's office in the back hallway. The room smelled faintly of old coffee and printer ink. Schedules covered one wall beside employee notices nobody read. Dale shut the door harder than necessary. "What were you thinking out there?" he demanded. "I was thinking Marcus didn't deserve to be treated like that. You challenged a customer in the middle of the dining room. A customer who was wrong." Dale pointed toward the restaurant floor. "That customer spends more money here in one night than you make in 3 months. Annie crossed her arms. "So that means he gets to accuse people publicly?" "That means we handle situations carefully." She stared at him. "You searched Marcus in front of everyone." Dale's face tightened. "I was trying to protect this restaurant." "No," Annie said. "You were trying to protect Richard Whitmore." The truth irritated him because he knew it was true. Dale sat down heavily behind the desk. "You're young, Annie. So let me explain something to you. In places like this, perception matters." She almost laughed. "Perception?" Marcus looked guilty because Mr. Whitmore decided he looked guilty. "And if that cufflink hadn't been in the bucket?" "But it was." Dale rubbed his forehead. "You don't understand how dangerous tonight could have been." Annie thought about her overdue tuition bill folded inside her backpack at home. About her mother counting prescription pills to make them last longer. About the rent notice taped beside their apartment mailbox last month. Dangerous looked different depending on who you were. "I understand exactly," she said quietly. Dale looked at her for a long moment, then sighed. "Richard Whitmore asked about you." That surprised her. "What?" "He asked your age, your school, your major." Annie frowned slightly. "Why?" "I don't know." Dale leaned back in his chair. "Maybe because nobody talks to him the way you did." "That wasn't my goal." "Well, it happened anyway." There was a knock on the office door before Annie could answer. Becky pushed it open slightly. Dale?" "What?" "Mr. Whitmore is asking for Annie." Both Annie and Dale looked up. Dale blinked once. "Right now?" Becky nodded. "Yeah." Annie felt her stomach tighten unexpectedly. Dale stood up immediately and adjusted his tie. "All right. Be polite this time." "I was polite." "No," Dale muttered, opening the office door. "You were honest. Rich people don't always enjoy the difference." They walked back toward the dining room together. The restaurant had mostly returned to normal. but Annie could still feel eyes following her as she crossed the floor. Richard Whitmore remained at table 12 alone now. His business guest had already left. The empty bourbon glass sat near his plate, and the diamond cufflink was back on his wrist where it belonged. When Annie approached, Richard looked up from the check folder in front of him. "You asked for me?" she said. Richard studied her for a second before speaking. "Sit down." Annie glanced around the restaurant. "Employees don't usually sit with customers." "I'm aware." Dale immediately jumped in. "Mr. Whitmore, if there's any issue—" "There isn't," Richard said without looking at him. "Actually, you can give us a minute." Dale hesitated, then forced a smile and walked away. Annie remained standing. Richard noticed. "You don't trust me enough to sit?" "That depends." "On what?" "Whether this is the part where I get fired or thanked." For the first time all night, the corner of Richard Whitmore's mouth almost lifted. "Honestly," he said, "I haven't decided yet." Annie stayed standing beside the table for another second before finally sliding into the chair across from Richard Whitmore. The leather seat still held warmth from the man who had been sitting there earlier. Around them, Silver Oak slowly returned to its usual rhythm. Waiters carried trays again. Wine glasses clinked softly. Someone near the piano laughed too loudly, trying to force the room back to normal. But the tension at table 12 had not disappeared. Richard leaned back slightly, studying Annie with the same focus he had probably used in boardrooms for years. "You embarrassed me tonight," he said. Annie met his eyes. "You embarrassed yourself tonight." The answer came so quickly that Richard almost smiled again, though this time the expression disappeared before it fully formed. "You always talk like that?" "Only when people deserve it." "That's dangerous." "For who?" Richard let out a quiet breath through his nose. "You really are 18. Annie glanced toward the kitchen doors. "If this conversation is about getting fired, I still have side work to finish." "It's not." "Then what is it about?" Richard rotated the bourbon glass slowly between his fingers, though the drink was gone. "You noticed details most people missed. That's because most people stopped paying attention the second you started yelling." His eyes narrowed slightly at that, but he accepted the hit without pushing back this time. "You said you study criminal justice." "Yes." "Why?" Annie shrugged once. "Somebody has to care when the wrong person gets blamed." Richard looked down at the cufflink on his wrist. "You think that's what happened tonight?" "I know that's what happened." "You talk in absolutes." "No," Annie said calmly. "I talk after observing." Richard stayed quiet for a moment. At another table nearby, a middle-aged couple stood to leave. The husband glanced toward Richard, recognized him, then quickly looked away again. Annie noticed it. Richard noticed her noticing it. "You watch people constantly, don't you?" he asked. "When you grow up around unstable situations, you learn to read rooms fast." Richard leaned back farther. "What does that mean?" "It means if my mother came home tired from work and too quiet, I knew the electric bill probably wasn't paid yet. It means if a landlord suddenly smiled too much, rent was probably going up. It means if somebody accused a black man before checking facts." She looked toward the kitchen where Marcus had disappeared earlier. "I knew exactly how that story usually ends." Richard's fingers stopped moving around the glass. For the first time since Annie sat down, his voice lost some of its sharpness. "You think race had something to do with tonight?" Annie gave him a look that answered before her words did. "You searched his pockets in front of a room full of strangers." "I didn't search him. Your manager did." "At your request." Richard's jaw tightened slightly. The cufflink was missing, and Marcus was convenient. The truth sat there between them. Richard looked away toward the dining room. "You make everything sound ugly." "No," Annie said softly. "Some things already are ugly. Most people just get uncomfortable hearing them out loud." That one stayed with him. Annie could tell. Dale appeared briefly near the bar, pretending to organize receipts while obviously trying to watch the conversation. Becky nearly dropped a tray when she saw Annie still sitting with Richard Whitmore 20 minutes after the incident. Richard noticed the staring too. "Your manager looks terrified. He thinks rich customers are natural disasters. And you don't?" "No, sir." Annie folded her hands loosely on the table. "I think rich people are just people who got used to not being questioned." Richard laughed once under his breath before catching himself. "You know," he said, "most employees spend their first year trying not to look me directly in the eye." Most employees probably need the job more than they need honesty. And you don't? That question hit closer than he intended. Annie thought briefly about the folded tuition notice inside her backpack at home. About her mother standing all day at the nursing home despite the pain in her knees. About counting grocery money before every paycheck. I need the job, she admitted. I just don't want to become the kind of person who stays quiet to keep it. Richard looked at her differently after that. Less like a server. More like a problem he couldn't categorize quickly. You know what your issue is? He asked. What? You're too confident. Annie almost smiled. No, I'm prepared. People confuse those two things all the time. Richard stared at her for a second longer than necessary. Then he reached into the inside pocket of his jacket again and placed a business card on the table between them. Whitmore Capital was embossed across the front in silver lettering. Annie looked at the card but didn't touch it. What's this? My direct office number. She frowned immediately. Why would I need that? Because people with instincts like yours usually don't stay servers forever. Annie still didn't pick up the card. And what exactly do you think my instincts are? You see patterns quickly. You stay calm under pressure. And you're willing to challenge people who intimidate everyone else in the room. You say that like it's a compliment. It is. Annie looked down at the card again. You barely know me. I know enough to recognize talent. Or maybe you just feel guilty. Richard did not answer right away. The silence itself became an answer. Annie nodded slightly. That's what I thought. You think this is about guilt? He asked. I think powerful people usually become generous after public embarrassment. That stung more than she intended. Richard sat back slowly. You really don't let anybody off easy, do you? Did Marcus get let off easy tonight? Again, no answer. A server passed nearby carrying fresh steaks to another table. The smell of grilled meat drifted through the air. Outside the front windows, rain had begun tapping softly against the glass. Richard looked at Annie carefully. What's your tuition? She blinked. Excuse me? How much? That's not your business. It could be. Annie finally picked up the business card, turning it once between her fingers before slipping it into the apron pocket at her waist. I'm not asking you for money. I know, Richard said quietly. That's why I'm still talking to you. For the first time since the night began, Annie didn't have an immediate response ready. Richard stood from the table and adjusted the same cuff that had caused all the trouble in the first place. Finish your shift, he said. And Annie? She looked up at him. You were right about one thing. What's that? He glanced briefly toward the kitchen doors where Marcus had disappeared earlier. 5 minutes was enough to change the direction of somebody's life. Then he walked toward the exit, leaving Annie alone at the table with the business card resting heavily in her apron pocket and the strange feeling that the night was not actually over yet. By the time Annie finished rolling silverware and wiping down her last section, it was almost midnight. The Silver Oak looked different after closing. Without the customers, the restaurant lost some of its performance. Chairs sat upside down on tables near the back wall. Half the lights had been dimmed. The jazz music was gone, replaced by the sound of dishwashers humming in the kitchen and tired employees talking softer than usual. Annie tied off a trash bag near the service station while Becky counted tips beside the register. You still thinking about him? Becky asked. Annie didn't look up. Who? Please. Becky snorted quietly. The billionaire who practically interviewed you over steak and bourbon. He didn't interview me. He gave you his private card. Annie pushed the trash bag aside. That doesn't mean anything. Becky zipped her purse closed. Men like Richard Whitmore don't hand out direct office numbers to random servers. Maybe he felt guilty. Maybe he's impressed. Annie grabbed her backpack from under the counter. Those two things aren't always different. Marcus walked out from the kitchen carrying his jacket over one arm. He looked exhausted, but steadier now than earlier. You heading home? He asked Annie. Yeah. Marcus hesitated before speaking again. Listen, thank you. You already thanked me. I know. He rubbed the back of his neck awkwardly. Still feels small, compared to what you did. Annie shrugged. I just said what everybody else should have said. Marcus gave a tired smile. Most people don't risk their jobs for kitchen staff. You're not kitchen staff. You know what I mean. She did. Marcus glanced toward the front windows where rain still slid down the glass outside. You got a ride? I'll catch the bus. At this hour? I've done worse. Marcus reached into his wallet and pulled out a folded $20 bill. No. Come on, Annie. No, Marcus. You saved me tonight. You don't owe me. Marcus held the money out anyway. Then let me feel useful. Annie looked at the bill for a second before gently pushing his hand back down. Buy groceries for your mom instead. Marcus laughed quietly through his nose. You really don't make life easy for people trying to thank you. That's because people confuse gratitude with debt. Marcus stared at her for a moment. Where'd you learn to talk like that? My mother, Annie said, slipping one strap of her backpack over her shoulder, and overdue bills. That made him laugh for real. Outside, the rain had turned lighter by the time Annie stepped onto the sidewalk. Downtown Atlanta shimmered under wet streetlights and reflections from passing cars. The cold air smelled like rain, gasoline, and late-night food carts closing for the night. Annie pulled her jacket tighter and started walking toward the bus stop 2 blocks away. Halfway there, she reached into her apron pocket and felt the edge of Richard Whitmore's business card still sitting inside. She stared at it under the streetlight. Whitmore Capital, direct office line. No handwritten note, no personal message, just expensive cardstock and silver lettering from a world that had probably never worried about overdraft fees. A black SUV rolled slowly past her, then stopped at the curb ahead. The rear passenger window lowered. Richard Whitmore looked out at her. Annie stopped walking immediately. You stalking employees now? She asked. Richard ignored the comment. Get in. It's raining. I'm fine. You're standing at a bus stop after midnight. I said I'm fine. Richard studied her for a second before speaking again. You distrust everybody with money? No. Annie slid the business card back into her pocket. Just people who think money fixes everything. And yet you kept my card. That doesn't mean I trust you. A faint look crossed Richard's face. Not irritation this time. Something closer to reluctant amusement. Fair enough, he said. Traffic hissed past on the wet road behind them. Richard glanced toward the empty bus stop bench. How long until your bus comes? 20 minutes. And you're comfortable waiting out here alone? Annie crossed her arms against the cold. You worried about me now? No, Richard said dryly. I'm worried about the headlines if Atlanta's newest detective freezes to death. Despite herself, Annie smiled a little. Richard noticed. There, he said. That's the first normal 18-year-old expression I've seen from you all night. It won't happen again. The driver in the front seat hid a smile. Richard opened the car door beside him. I'm heading north anyway. Let me drive you home. Annie hesitated. Every warning her mother had ever given her about rich men, power, and obligation moved through her head at once. Richard seemed to read part of that hesitation on her face. You can send your location to someone if it makes you feel safer, he said, or keep the door unlocked the whole ride. I'm offering transportation, not a kidnapping. That joke sounded expensive. It was. Annie looked down the empty street again. No bus lights yet. Finally, she sighed and climbed into the SUV. The interior smelled faintly of leather and cedar. Warm air hit her cold hands almost immediately. Richard watched her settle into the seat across from him. You always this stubborn? Yes. Must be exhausting. You have no idea. The SUV pulled away from the curb smoothly. For a few minutes, neither of them spoke. Rain tapped softly against the windows while downtown lights blurred past outside. Then Richard glanced at her backpack sitting beside her. You carry all your textbooks around at midnight? I came straight from class to work. What classes? Intro to criminal law. Ethics. English comp. Richard nodded once. And after that, you serve steak to rich people until midnight. That's usually how rent works. He looked out the window for a second. What about your father? The question changed the air inside the car immediately. Annie's voice cooled. What about him? He around? No. Richard noticed the warning in her tone and let the subject go. Instead, he asked, Your mother know you argued with a billionaire tonight? Annie leaned her head lightly against the seat. No. And if she did? She'd probably tell me I should have charged consulting fees. That earned a real laugh from Richard this time. The SUV continued through the wet Atlanta streets while Annie looked out the window, unaware that Richard Whitmore was beginning to see something he had not expected to find inside a restaurant server carrying an ice bucket. Not attitude. Potential. The SUV left downtown behind and moved into quieter streets lined with aging apartment buildings, laundromats, pawn shops, and small churches with glowing signs out front promising Sunday salvation. Rainwater streaked across the windows while Annie watched familiar neighborhoods slide by. Richard noticed it immediately. "You stopped looking at the buildings," he said. "What? When we were downtown, you kept watching outside. Now you don't." Annie shrugged lightly. "Nothing to look at here." "I already know what it looks like." The answer stayed with him longer than she expected. The driver slowed at a red light near a 24-hour gas station. A man stood under the awning smoking beside a broken ice machine. Across the street, a woman dragged 2 grocery bags through the rain with a sleeping child balanced against her shoulder. Richard followed Annie's eyes toward them. "You see stories everywhere, don't you?" he asked. "I see bills everywhere." That earned another quiet breath of amusement from him. "You always answer questions like that?" "Usually. You make conversation difficult. My mother says honesty saves time." Richard looked out the window again. "Your mother sounds interesting." "She's tired," Annie corrected softly. "There's a difference." The SUV turned into a narrow apartment complex with faded numbers painted on the curbs. One of the parking lot lights flickered on and off near the dumpsters. Richard's expression changed slightly. Not disgust. Recognition. He had known places like this once, long before expensive suits and investment meetings. He had simply spent years pretending otherwise. "This is home?" he asked. "For now." The SUV stopped near Building C. Annie reached for the door handle immediately. "Wait," Richard said. She paused. "How many classes are you taking this semester?" Annie frowned. "Why do you care?" "I asked a question." "4. And work?" "4 nights here. 2 lunch shifts on weekends when Dale's desperate." "That sounds miserable." "It sounds expensive," Annie replied. Richard leaned back slightly in his seat. "You know, most people would have taken the money tonight." "What money?" "The tip." Annie looked at him carefully. "Most people don't like feeling indebted." "A tip doesn't create debt." "Depends who gives it." Richard understood exactly what she meant. Outside, rain tapped softly against the roof of the SUV. "You really think I'd hold money over your head?" "I think powerful people are used to buying access to people." "That's not an answer. It's the only one you're getting." For a second, Richard almost looked offended again, but the feeling faded before it fully settled. "You challenge everybody like this?" "No," Annie said. "Only the ones used to never hearing no." That one pulled a low laugh out of him before he could stop it. The driver glanced briefly into the rearview mirror, surprised to hear it. Annie opened the door halfway, then stopped when Richard spoke again. "You said you study criminal justice." "Yes." "What do you actually want to do with it?" The question caught her off guard because nobody asked it seriously anymore. Most people only asked what job she wanted, how much money it paid, or whether she planned to transfer schools eventually. Nobody asked what she wanted. Annie looked out toward the apartment building. "When I was 16, she said quietly, "a security guard followed my friend Malik around a grocery store for 20 minutes because he thought Malik looked suspicious." She paused. Meanwhile, 2 white kids were stuffing candy into their backpacks 3 aisles over. Richard listened without interrupting. "Malik got searched outside in front of everybody," Annie continued. "They found nothing. The guard never apologized. He just walked away." "And that stayed with you?" "It stayed with Malik too." Richard nodded slowly. "That's why criminal justice? That's why truth matters." The sentence settled heavily inside the car. Richard glanced toward the apartment building again. "You think systems can actually change?" Annie gave a small shrug. "Depends who's running them. And if the people running them never want to admit they're wrong, then somebody has to force them to look." Richard became quiet after that. Annie stepped out into the rain before he could ask another question. Cold air rushed into the warm SUV immediately. "Annie." She looked back. Richard reached into his jacket pocket again and pulled out a folded receipt from the restaurant. He wrote something quickly on the back with a silver pen, then handed it to her. Annie hesitated before taking it. "What is this?" "Read it later." "That sounds suspicious." "It's a phone number. You already gave me one. This one gets answered faster." She looked down at the handwriting but didn't unfold the paper. Richard rested one arm against the door frame. "Your mother home?" "Probably asleep by now." "She works nights too?" "Nursing home." Richard nodded once, almost to himself. "Figures. What does that mean?" "It means women like your mother usually keep half this country standing while nobody notices." Annie studied him carefully after that sentence. It was the first thing he had said all night that sounded less like a businessman and more like a man remembering something personal. Rainwater slid down the side of the SUV between them. "You weren't always rich, were you?" Annie asked. Richard's eyes shifted toward her. "No," he admitted after a moment. "I just got better at hiding the parts before." Neither of them spoke for a few seconds. Then Annie stepped back from the vehicle. "Good night, Mr. Whitmore." "Richard." She almost smiled again. "Good night, Richard." The SUV pulled away slowly, red taillights fading through the rain while Annie stood in the parking lot holding the folded receipt in one hand. Upstairs, a television flickered behind the curtains of her apartment window. Annie climbed the wet stairs quietly and unlocked the door. Inside, the apartment smelled faintly of laundry detergent and reheated soup. A small lamp glowed near the couch where Linda Johnson had fallen asleep sitting upright in her nursing scrubs. One shoe had slipped halfway off her foot. Annie stood there watching her mother for a moment. The exhaustion on Linda's face looked older than her actual age. Annie quietly placed her backpack near the couch and pulled a blanket over her mother's shoulders. Linda stirred slightly. "You home, baby?" "Yeah." "How was work?" Annie looked down at the folded receipt still in her hand. Complicated, she thought, but out loud she only said, "Long night." Linda nodded sleepily. "There's leftover soup on the stove." Annie smiled faintly. "Okay." As her mother drifted back to sleep, Annie unfolded the receipt under the lamp. Written across the back, beneath Richard Whitmore's number, were 6 simple words. "You were right to speak up." Annie stared at the sentence for a long time before folding the paper carefully and slipping it into her backpack beside unpaid tuition notices and class notes for criminal law. Annie barely slept. By 6:30 the next morning, the apartment already smelled like burnt toast and cheap coffee. Rain still clung to the windows from the night before, while Linda Johnson stood in the kitchen wearing faded nursing scrubs and rubbing one knee with the heel of her hand. "You were tossing around all night," Linda said without turning from the stove. "Bad dreams or bad customers?" Annie sat at the tiny kitchen table with a textbook open in front of her but hadn't read the same page in 10 minutes. "Both." Linda glanced over her shoulder. "You going to elaborate on that, or should I start guessing names?" Annie almost smiled into her coffee cup. "Why do mothers always know when something happened?" "Because tired children become loud even when they're quiet." Linda slid a plate with toast and eggs onto the table before grabbing her own coffee mug. The apartment kitchen was barely large enough for both of them to stand comfortably, but they had learned years ago how to move around each other without colliding. Annie reached into her backpack and pulled out the folded receipt Richard had written on. Linda noticed immediately. "What's that?" "Nothing." "That answer alone tells me it's definitely something." Annie handed over the receipt reluctantly. Linda adjusted her glasses and read the words twice. "You were right to speak up." Then her eyes dropped to the phone number underneath. "Who's Richard Whitmore?" Annie froze for half a second. "You know who he is." Linda looked up sharply. "The Richard Whitmore?" Annie nodded once. Linda lowered the paper slowly. "Why exactly does a billionaire leave handwritten notes for my daughter?" "It wasn't like that." Mom." Linda leaned back in the chair, studying her daughter's face carefully. "Annie." There it was. The full name voice. Annie sighed and finally told her everything. Not quickly either. She described the missing cufflink, Marcus getting searched in front of the restaurant, Richard yelling for police, the ice bucket, the silence afterward, and the ride home through the rain. Linda listened without interrupting once. By the end, her coffee had gone cold. "That man searched Marcus in front of everybody?" she asked quietly. "He made Dale do it." "That's the same thing." Annie nodded. Linda shook her head slowly, disappointment settling into her face in the way only older people could carry it. "Your grandfather used to say money doesn't change character. It just removes witnesses." Annie looked down at the table. "You did the right thing," Linda continued, "but rich men don't enjoy being corrected publicly." He didn't seem angry by the end. "That's almost worse." Annie frowned. "What does that mean?" "It means now he's interested." The sentence sat strangely in the room. Linda stood and rinsed her mug in the sink before speaking again. "Men with power aren't used to hearing honesty from people who can't benefit them." Annie folded the receipt carefully. "You make him sound dangerous." "I make him sound rich." That answer carried years inside it. Annie watched her mother wince slightly while reaching for her purse near the counter. "Your knee bad again?" Linda brushed it off immediately. "Long shift yesterday." "You said that yesterday too, and I'll probably say it tomorrow." Annie hated how normal that answer sounded. You should take a day off. Linda laughed softly. And pay rent with what? Positive thinking? Before Annie could respond, her phone buzzed on the table. Unknown number. Both women looked at it. Linda raised one eyebrow. Well? Annie stared at the screen for 2 rings before answering carefully. Hello? Good morning, Annie. Richard Whitmore's voice sounded calmer over the phone than it had in the restaurant. Annie straightened slightly in her chair. How did you get this number? You wrote it on your employee paperwork. That feels mildly illegal. Richard ignored the comment. You in class today? Yes. What time do you finish? Annie exchanged a quick glance with her mother. Linda quietly grabbed her purse and pretended not to listen while obviously listening to everything. 3:30, Annie answered cautiously. Why? There's a luncheon at Whitmore Capital tomorrow. Some people from our internal investigations department will be there. Annie frowned immediately. Why are you telling me this? Because I think you should come. Silence. Linda slowly turned around at the sink. Annie lowered her voice. You're serious? Yes. Why? Because last night you noticed things trained professionals miss. I'm a waitress. You're a criminal justice student. That still doesn't explain why a billionaire is inviting me to a corporate lunch. Richard paused briefly before answering. Maybe I'm curious whether your instincts work outside a steakhouse. Annie rubbed her forehead slowly. Mr. Whitmore. Richard, she corrected reluctantly. I can't just walk into some giant corporate building. Why not? Because people like me don't belong in places like that. The line stayed quiet for 1 second too long. Then Richard spoke more softly than before. That, he said, sounds exactly like something somebody taught you to believe. Annie didn't answer. Richard continued. Tomorrow, noon. I'll leave your name downstairs with security. I didn't say yes. No, he said calmly. But you also didn't say no. The call ended before she could argue further. Annie stared at the phone in her hand. Linda crossed her arms. Well, he invited me to his company. Linda blinked once. Excuse me? Apparently he thinks I should meet his investigation department. Linda walked back toward the table slowly and sat down again. Annie, I know. No, I don't think you do. Annie looked at her mother. What? Linda folded her hands together carefully. People like Richard Whitmore don't randomly open doors. If he's opening one, it means he sees something. That doesn't mean I should walk through it. Linda looked toward the window where rainwater still slid down the glass. Baby, she said quietly. Sometimes people spend their whole lives waiting for one door to open. Annie thought about the restaurant, the cufflink, Marcus standing there humiliated, Richard staring at her afterward like she had interrupted something larger than dinner. Then she looked down at the folded receipt again. You were right to speak up. For the first time since the night before, Annie began wondering whether those words had changed more than just one argument inside a restaurant. Annie spent most of Thursday trying to convince herself she was not actually going to Whitmore Capital. By noon, she was standing outside a 40-story glass building in downtown Atlanta wearing the only blazer she owned, one she had borrowed from Becky after class that morning. It makes you look smart, Becky had said while handing it over. I already am smart. Yeah, but rich people like visual aids. Now Annie stood near the entrance, watching executives move through revolving doors with coffee cups, security badges, and the kind of confidence people developed after years of never checking their bank account before buying lunch. She looked down at her shoes once. Clean. Not expensive, but clean. A security guard near the front desk glanced toward her. Can I help you? Annie hesitated briefly. Richard Whitmore said he left my name downstairs. The guard typed something into his computer, then immediately straightened. Oh, Annie Johnson? That's me. The man's entire tone changed. 28th floor. Private elevator on the left. That reaction alone made her uncomfortable. Inside the elevator, mirrored walls reflected every nervous thought she was trying not to show. Annie adjusted the sleeves of Becky's blazer and caught herself doing it. The motion reminded her instantly of Richard adjusting his cuff in the restaurant. Funny how one moment could keep replaying itself. The elevator opened directly into Whitmore Capital's executive floor. Quiet carpet, dark wood walls, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Atlanta. Everything smelled expensive in a way that tried not to look expensive. A receptionist looked up immediately. Miss Johnson? Annie almost turned around hearing the title. Yes. He's expecting you. Of course he was. The receptionist guided her down a long hallway lined with framed photographs of hotels, office towers, and development projects Richard's company owned across the country. Halfway down the hall, Annie slowed slightly in front of one picture, a black and white photo of construction workers from the 1980s standing beside steel beams. One man near the center looked strangely familiar. "You coming?" the receptionist asked gently. Annie blinked and kept walking. Richard's office doors stood open at the far end of the hall. He looked different in daylight. At the restaurant he had seemed sharp and intimidating. Here he looked controlled, built into the building itself somehow. Like the office had learned his personality. He glanced up from a stack of papers when Annie entered. "You came." Annie stayed near the doorway. "You sound surprised. I'm used to people saying yes because they want something. And me? You looked like you almost didn't come because you didn't." That was accurate enough to irritate her slightly. Richard stood and motioned toward the seating area near the windows. "Relax. This isn't a job interview. That somehow makes it more suspicious." A faint smile touched the corner of his mouth again. Annie noticed he did that more often now. Not fully smiling. Just almost. She sat carefully on the edge of the chair while Richard poured coffee from a silver carafe nearby. "You take cream? I take affordable tuition." Richard handed her the coffee anyway. Still doing that. Doing what? Turning every conversation into a social statement. Annie accepted the cup, maybe because social statements are usually attached to real life. Before Richard could answer, the office doors opened again. A gray-haired woman entered carrying a tablet and stopped briefly when she saw Annie. "Sorry," she said. "I didn't realize you had company." "It's fine," Richard replied. "Elaine, this is Annie Johnson." Elaine's eyes moved over Annie quickly but politely. "The restaurant girl." Annie raised one eyebrow immediately. Richard noticed. That sounded worse than she meant it. Elaine sighed. "I've worked with him 22 years. Trust me, I've said worse." Annie relaxed slightly after that. Elaine handed Richard a tablet. "The luncheon starts in 15 minutes. Internal investigations already arrived." Richard nodded. "Good." Elaine glanced once more at Annie before leaving. "You made an impression, by the way." The door closed behind her. Annie looked at Richard. "Restaurant girl? You'd be surprised how much attention you got after that night." "That's not comforting." "It wasn't meant to be." Richard sat across from her this time instead of behind the massive desk. Annie noticed that too. "You ever been inside a place like this before?" he asked. "No." "What do you think?" Annie looked around slowly. The polished wood. The skyline view. "It feels quiet." Richard frowned slightly. "Quiet?" "Yeah. Like everybody here earns enough money to avoid yelling." That answer caught him off guard again. "You know," he said, "most people walk in here and talk about success. Success usually sounds quieter when you've never had it." Richard studied her carefully after that. Then he reached toward the stack of folders beside him and pulled one free. Annie immediately noticed her own name typed across the tab. Her expression changed. "You looked into me?" Richard remained calm. "Basic background. That's creepy. That's responsible. You ran a background check on a waitress? On a criminal justice student with exceptional observational instincts." Annie stared at the folder. "What exactly did you find?" "Straight A's. Perfect attendance record at school. 2 jobs. No disciplinary history." He paused briefly. "And overdue tuition payments." Annie's face hardened immediately. "That part wasn't your business." "No," Richard admitted. "But it explains why somebody your age works 6 days a week and still looks exhausted." Annie set the coffee cup down carefully before she spilled it. "You invited me here because you pity me?" Richard's expression sharpened instantly. "No, because if this is charity." "It isn't." "Then what is it?" Richard leaned forward slightly. "An investment," he said. "And I don't invest in people because I feel sorry for them." Annie stared at Richard for a long moment after he said the word investment. The office suddenly felt colder than before. "You don't even know me," she said quietly. Richard leaned back in his chair. "That's not true. You read a file. I observed you. At a restaurant. At a moment where pressure revealed character." Annie folded her arms. "You talk like everything is a business lesson." "That's because most things are." "That sounds lonely." Richard almost answered immediately, then stopped himself. Annie noticed that too. Outside the office windows, Atlanta stretched beneath gray afternoon clouds. Cars moved silently far below, while the executive floor remained calm enough to hear the ticking of the clock near Richard's bookshelf. Annie glanced again at the folder with her name on it. "You really looked through my school records?" "I asked my assistant to verify a few things." "Without asking me?" Richard nodded once. "Yes. That's insane. It's thorough. You keep saying things like that as if money gives you permission." Richard's expression tightened slightly. "Money gives access. There's a difference. To people like you, maybe." That one landed. Richard stood and walked toward the windows, sliding one hand into his pocket. "You know what I saw the night at the restaurant? A billionaire humiliating a working man?" A short breath escaped him. "Besides that," Annie stayed quiet, "I saw a room full of adults freeze because somebody loud and powerful decided he was right." Richard turned toward her again. "You were the only person willing to challenge it." "You mean I was the only one dumb enough?" "No," Richard said calmly. "You were the only one willing to risk something." Annie looked down briefly. He was right about that part. Richard returned to the seating area. "You know how many people sit in meetings here every day and tell me what they think I want to hear?" "How many?" "All of them." "That sounds like your fault." A low laugh slipped out before he could stop it. "Probably." Annie watched him carefully. It still felt strange seeing a man who had shouted across a restaurant now sitting quietly discussing ethics like he had nowhere else to be. "What exactly do you want from me?" she asked finally. Richard answered without hesitation. "Lunch, conversation, and maybe an introduction to people who can help your future." "That sounds dangerously close to charity again." "It's not." "Then stop talking around it and explain it." Richard nodded slowly, almost approving the directness. "Whitmore Capital has an internal investigations division," he said. "Fraud, financial misconduct, employee theft, corporate compliance." Annie frowned slightly. "You investigate your own company?" "We try to." "And you think I belong there?" "I think you notice details faster than most trained analysts." Annie looked unconvinced. Richard continued, "The average person sees conflict and reacts emotionally. You reconstructed a timeline under pressure while everyone else panicked." "I work in customer service," Annie replied. "That's basically survival training." Again, that almost smile appeared on his face. A knock interrupted them before he could answer. Elaine stepped inside holding a tablet. "They're seated downstairs," she said. Then her eyes moved toward Annie. "You still coming to the luncheon?" Annie blinked. That wasn't decided yet. Elaine looked at Richard knowingly. "Ah. He's still doing the intense, mysterious billionaire routine." Richard sighed. "Elaine." "What?" "I've known you since Reagan was president." Annie couldn't help it. She laughed softly for the first time since arriving. Elaine pointed toward her immediately. "There. That. You should do that more often." Annie shook her head. "People keep telling me that, because you walk around like life already owes you 3 apologies." Richard muttered under his breath. "That might be the most accurate thing you've ever said." Elaine handed him the tablet. "You have 10 minutes. She started toward the door, then paused beside Annie. "For what it's worth, he doesn't invite people here unless he sees something valuable." Annie raised one eyebrow. "You talking about talent or profit?" Elaine smiled faintly. "With Richard?" "Usually both." After she left, Annie leaned back slightly in her chair. "Your assistant scares me more than you. She scares everybody." "I can see why." Richard checked the time on his watch, then looked back at Annie. "Walk downstairs with me." "That sounds less optional than before." "It probably is." They left the office together and moved through the executive floor. Employees glanced up as Richard passed, immediately straightening or lowering their voices. Annie noticed every single reaction. "You see that?" Richard asked quietly while they walked. "What?" "The way people change when somebody with authority enters a room. I saw it the second you walked into the restaurant." Richard nodded once. The elevator ride down was quiet. Annie watched the floor numbers light up while Richard studied her reflection in the mirrored wall. "You're uncomfortable here," he said. "Yes." "Why?" "Because places like this weren't built for people like me." Richard answered immediately this time. "That's not true." "Maybe not intentionally," Annie said, "but somehow they still end up full of the same kinds of people." The elevator doors opened into a private dining floor. Men and women in tailored suits stood around round tables discussing numbers Annie could probably never imagine earning. Conversations softened when Richard entered. Then people noticed Annie beside him. A few expressions shifted instantly. Curiosity, confusion, assumption. Annie knew those looks too well. Richard noticed her noticing them. One older executive approached with a polite smile. Richard. Then his eyes flicked toward Annie. And this is? Annie Johnson, Richard said calmly. A criminal justice student who solved a theft accusation faster than my security consultants would have. The executive blinked once, caught off guard. Annie extended her hand politely. Nice to meet you. The man shook it slowly. You work for Whitmore? Not currently. Something about the answer made Richard glance sideways at her. Then another executive joined them. Then another. Questions started coming quickly. Where do you study? How old are you? What happened at the restaurant? Annie answered carefully at first, then more naturally as the conversation moved along. Within 15 minutes she realized something strange. These people were listening to her. Actually listening. Not because she carried a tray. Not because she was taking an order. Not because they wanted something. Richard watched the shift happen quietly from across the room. And for the first time in years, he found himself wondering whether success meant building towers and companies, or simply being the kind of person who could recognize talent before the world gave it permission to matter. By the end of the luncheon, Annie's head hurt from hearing numbers with too many zeros attached to them. Corporate fraud percentages, real estate acquisitions, insurance disputes, internal theft investigations. The conversations moved quickly around the room, but Annie noticed something else beneath all the polished language. Power had its own accent. People interrupted less around Richard Whitmore. They laughed slightly harder at his jokes. They paused before disagreeing with him. Even the executives who outranked everyone else still watched his reactions before speaking too freely. Annie noticed all of it. Richard noticed her noticing all of it. As the luncheon ended, groups slowly broke apart around the room. Some executives left immediately for meetings, while others lingered near the coffee station continuing private conversations. Annie stood near one of the tall windows overlooking downtown Atlanta when a man in a gray suit approached her holding a cup of black coffee. You're the restaurant girl, he said. Annie looked over calmly. People really need to stop introducing me that way. The man smirked faintly. Fair point. Daniel Mercer, head of internal investigations. She shook his hand. Firm grip, watchful eyes, mid-50s. The kind of man who probably trusted evidence more than people. You're younger than I expected, Daniel said. You say that like disappointment. No, he replied, more like concern. Annie crossed her arms lightly. Concern about what? Daniel glanced around the room before lowering his voice slightly. People in this building are going to become interested in you very quickly. That sounds unhealthy. It usually is. Annie almost smiled. Daniel nodded toward Richard across the room. He doesn't bring outsiders into executive functions. So everyone keeps telling me. That's because everyone keeps noticing. Annie looked toward Richard. He stood near the far table speaking with two senior partners. But every few seconds his attention drifted back toward the room, unconsciously checking where Annie was. Daniel caught it too. He sees something in you, Daniel said. That makes one of us. Daniel took another sip of coffee. No. You see it too. You just distrust the reason. Before Annie could answer, Richard walked over. Daniel. Richard. Daniel looked between them briefly. You weren't exaggerating. Richard's mouth shifted slightly. I rarely do. That confidence must be exhausting for everybody around you. It is, Annie said before Richard could answer. Daniel laughed quietly into his coffee cup. Richard looked at Annie. You enjoying yourself? That depends. Is being interrogated by executives part of the lunch package? You handled it well. That's because none of them searched my pockets first. The sentence cut cleaner than anger would have. Richard's expression tightened for a brief moment. Daniel noticed immediately. What happened? Richard answered before Annie could. I made a mistake. Daniel looked surprised by the admission alone. That sounds painful, he muttered. You have no idea, Richard replied dryly. Annie glanced toward the elevators. I should probably go. I still have classwork tonight. Richard nodded once. I'll have someone drive you. No, that wasn't a question. And that wasn't permission. Daniel hid another smile behind his coffee. Richard sighed softly. You reject help like it insulted your family. Sometimes help comes with strings. And sometimes it comes with opportunity. Annie looked directly at him. People who grew up with opportunity always say that. For a second, neither of them spoke. Then Daniel quietly excused himself, suddenly aware this conversation no longer belonged to him. Once he walked away, Richard lowered his voice slightly. "You think I don't understand where you come from? I think you forgot." That one landed hard. Richard looked out the windows toward the city below. "Maybe I did." Annie watched him carefully. He looked older in silence. Not physically older, just heavier somehow. Like memory had weight, and somebody had suddenly handed his back a full box of it. "When I was 22, Richard said quietly. "My father lost our house." Annie blinked slightly, surprised he was continuing. "We lived in Birmingham, small place. My mother worked 2 jobs after that." He gave a short breath through his nose. "I used to promise myself if I ever made money, nobody in my family would feel powerless again." Annie listened without interrupting. Richard glanced toward her. "Then, somewhere along the way, I got used to being the loudest person in the room." "The problem isn't being loud," Annie said softly. "The problem is when everybody else becomes too afraid to speak." Richard looked at her for a long moment after that. Then he nodded once. "Fair." The room around them continued moving with executive conversations and polished business smiles, but for a moment neither of them seemed connected to it anymore. Finally, Richard reached into his jacket pocket and handed Annie a thin envelope. She frowned immediately. "What is this?" "Open it later." That's exactly what suspicious rich people say. "It's not money." That somehow sounds more dangerous. Richard almost smiled again. "Probably." Annie hesitated before taking the envelope. "You know," she said, "my mother still thinks this whole thing is weird. She's smart. She also thinks powerful men don't do favors unless they expect ownership afterward." Richard's expression dimmed slightly. "Your mother's probably lived long enough to believe that." "She has." He nodded slowly. "Then tell her this isn't ownership," he said. "It's recognition." Annie looked down at the envelope in her hands. Before she could respond, Richard spoke again. "I changed something this morning." "What?" "At Silver Oak." Annie looked up. Richard adjusted the cufflink on his wrist unconsciously before continuing. "My company owns the restaurant group that manages that location." Annie's eyes narrowed slightly. "Of course it does. I had legal draft a policy update this morning. No employee can be publicly accused, searched, or detained without evidence and management review." For the first time in several minutes, Annie looked genuinely caught off guard. Richard continued quietly. "Marcus keeps his job, and your manager received a very unpleasant phone call." Annie stared at him. "You did that because of one night?" "No," Richard said. "Because one night showed me something ugly I should have noticed a long time ago." The words stayed between them quietly. Then Annie looked down at the envelope again. "What's inside?" Richard's voice remained calm. "An internship offer." Annie did not open the envelope until she got home. The apartment was quiet except for the television humming softly in the corner while Linda folded laundry on the couch. A plastic container of leftover soup sat on the coffee table beside a stack of unpaid bills and a bottle of pain medication with only a few pills left inside. Linda looked up the moment Annie walked through the door. "Well?" Annie slipped off her shoes slowly. "You ever have one of those days where life feels like it's trying to prank you?" Linda narrowed her eyes immediately. "That sounds expensive." Annie laughed under her breath and handed her the envelope. Linda wiped her hands on a towel before opening it carefully. Her expression changed halfway through reading. Then she looked up sharply. "Paid internship?" Annie sat down heavily in the chair near the window. Apparently, Linda read the page again more slowly this time. "Whitmore Capital Internal Investigations Internship Program. Flexible hours. Tuition assistance. Mentorship opportunity. Transportation stipend." Linda lowered the paper carefully like it might disappear if she moved too fast. "This is real?" "I think so." "You think so?" "I haven't signed anything." Linda sat very still for a moment. Then she looked at her daughter with an expression Annie had not seen in years, hope mixed with fear. The kind older people carried when life disappointed them enough times that good news started feeling suspicious. "What are you going to do?" Linda asked quietly. Annie rubbed both hands over her face. "I don't know." "That's a lie." Annie looked up. "You already know," Linda said. "You're just scared of needing it." The truth of that irritated Annie immediately because it sounded too accurate. "I don't want charity." Linda shook her head gently. "Baby, charity is when somebody gives you something to feel good about themselves." Opportunity is when somebody opens a door because they think you can walk through it. Annie looked down at the internship letter again. Part of her still distrusted all of it. Rich people, corporate buildings, men like Richard Whitmore suddenly deciding her future mattered. But another part of her remembered something else. Marcus standing in front of that dining room while people watched him like he was already guilty. And herself, stepping forward because nobody else would. "You know what scares me?" Annie asked softly. Linda folded the internship letter carefully. "What? What if this changes everything?" Linda smiled sadly. "That's usually what doors do." 3 days later, Annie walked back into the Silver Oak for her evening shift. The restaurant looked exactly the same. Amber lights, jazz music, expensive bourbon behind the bar. But something underneath it had shifted. People looked at her differently now. Not dramatically, just enough to notice. Kyle nodded awkwardly when she passed him near the kitchen. "Hey, Annie." "Hey." Marcus walked out carrying a tray and stopped when he saw her. "There she is. You say that like I survived a war." "You kinda did." Annie smiled faintly. Marcus leaned closer. "Dale's been acting weird all week. That's because rich people yelled at him." "Good." Before Annie could answer, Dale himself appeared from the office hallway, adjusting his tie nervously. "Annie," he said. "Can I talk to you for a second?" Marcus immediately frowned. "Why?" "It's fine," Annie said quietly. Dale shifted awkwardly beside the service station while servers moved around them pretending not to listen. "I owe you an apology," he muttered finally. Annie blinked once. Dale rubbed the back of his neck. "What happened to Marcus shouldn't have happened. I handled it badly." Marcus crossed his arms. "That's one way to put it." Dale sighed heavily. "Richard Whitmore personally called corporate. That sounds terrifying." It was. For the first time since Annie met him, Dale actually looked embarrassed instead of defensive. "I should have backed my staff before assuming the worst," he admitted quietly. Annie studied him for a second, then nodded once. "Yeah, you should have." Dale accepted the hit without arguing. A hostess suddenly hurried toward them from the front entrance. Annie? What?" "There's someone asking for you." Annie frowned. "Who?" The hostess glanced toward the dining room. "You'll see." Annie walked past the bar and froze slightly when she saw Richard Whitmore standing near table 12. The same table, same overhead light, same side bucket stand beside it. But this time nobody was shouting. Richard wore a dark gray suit tonight, both cufflinks secured neatly at his wrists. When he noticed Annie approaching, he did something that surprised almost everyone nearby. He stood up first. Not because he was angry, because he was showing respect. Marcus noticed immediately from across the room. Becky nearly stopped carrying drinks altogether. Annie folded her arms lightly. "You enjoy dramatic entrances." Richard glanced around the restaurant. "I thought this place deserved a calmer memory." She looked toward table 12 again. The ice bucket sat there polished and empty. A strange silence passed between them, not uncomfortable this time. Richard spoke first. "Did you read the internship offer?" "Yes." "And?" "I haven't decided." "That usually means yes." "It usually means I'm thinking." Richard nodded once. "Fair enough." For a moment they simply stood there while the restaurant moved around them. Then Richard looked at the side bucket stand and shook his head slightly. "All this over a cufflink?" Annie looked at him carefully. "No." Richard glanced back toward her. "All this," she said quietly, because somebody was finally willing to stop and look before blaming the easiest person in the room. The words settled between them. Richard adjusted his sleeve unconsciously, then caught himself and laughed softly under his breath. Annie noticed that too. "You know," he said, "I've spent most of my life thinking power meant never being questioned. And now?" Richard looked around the restaurant once more. At Marcus working calmly near the bar, at the servers moving through the dining room, at Annie standing in front of him no longer looking like someone asking permission to exist. "Now I think power might actually be measured by how people treat someone who can't fight back." Annie said nothing. Richard reached into his jacket pocket and placed something gently on the table between them. Not money. A new student ID holder from Whitmore Capital with Annie's name already printed beneath intern investigator. Annie stared at it. Richard smiled faintly. 5 minutes, he said quietly. That's all it took. Annie looked at the badge, then at the empty ice bucket beside the table where everything had started. Some people spent their whole lives waiting for someone powerful to finally listen to them. That night, all she had asked for was 5 minutes. And somehow, it had been enough. The lesson of this story is simple. Never judge someone before you know the truth. Power should not be used to shame the weak, and silence can hurt an innocent person. Sometimes, justice begins when one brave person asks for a chance to prove what everyone else refuses to see. This video is a work of fiction created with the assistance of artificial intelligence. All characters, events, and situations are not real and do not represent any actual people or true stories. The content is intended for storytelling and emotional illustration only.